Dr. Lewis will be our first speaker, and he will be speaking about the dramatic tale of Sabina Spielrein. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that a lot. The topic today, having to do with women's voices, and maybe we should have had this conference a couple of weeks ago on March 8th, which was International Women's Day, and with the time that is spent in Europe, they don't celebrate Mother's Day. They celebrate International Women's Day. We don't celebrate that here. I'm not sure why. Through all my higher education, my really important mentors have always been women. They've been my mothers, my intellectual mothers. When I was at Michigan State University, I had the good fortune of being mentored by Marion Kinjay. Marion Kinjay she was born in Belgium, educated in Belgium, came to the United States in 1948, studied at Columbia, studied at NYU, did her postdoc out at University of Chicago with Carl Rogers, and being an undergraduate out of Michigan State, I got exposed to existential psychology, humanistic psychology. She wrote a book on being human. She made us read C.S. Lewis. She made us read Arthur Koestler, The Ghost and the Machine. I mean, nobody else was taking me down that path except Marion Kinjay. When I received an academic scholarship to the New School for Social Research to do my graduate work, I came across another mother, Mary Henley. Mary Henley, she was protege of Max Wertheimer. And Wertheimer was one of a triad of the German Gestalt psychologists of Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kerler, Kurt Kafka, and actually Wertheimer founded the graduate psychology at the New School, the psychology department at the New School. And I was so honored to have her take me under her wing. She always, this was her thing. If you were in a seminar with her, she would always say, she would make sure she put me in my place. I wasn't Dr. Lewis at the time. She would say, Mr. Lewis, I think you're on a fishing expedition. She would always put people in their place in a very, very sort of European way. And not to mention my association with Hannah Arendt, who was there at the time. So the major people who taught me anything were all females. They were not forgotten. They were not erased. And I just wanted to say that to begin with. Sabina Spielrein, she's become a feminist icon and represents the plight of so many women of her day who were abused, denigrated, and perceived as mad. I mean, just to show you how pervasive this was, in the 1930s, a group of young Parisian mathematicians rebuilt mathematics on more secure ground with something called set theory. That is until Alexander Grothendieck, who was a Berliner, born in 1928, he revolutionized the ideology and developed category theory in mathematics. But another figure in this modern transformation of mathematics was Emmy Noether. She was born in Bavaria in 1882, which really places Sabina Spielrein as a cohort, because Sabina was born in Russia in 1885. It was only really a 3-year difference between the two of them. Like Sabina, Emmy, though creating the abstract approach which inspired category theory, she was a woman in a male academic world, thus barred from holding a professorship in I hope I'm saying this right, Göttingen University? I'm not sure if it's right. Please.
I think it's Göttingen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And was even blocked from giving unpaid lectures at the university, leading David Hilbert, the dean of German mathematics, to say, quotes, "I see no reason why her sex should be an impediment to her appointment. After all, we are a university, not a bathhouse." Well, Sabina was born in 1885 into a wealthy Jewish family in Rostov-on-Don in the Russian Empire. She was the eldest of 5 children, and all 3 of her brothers later became eminent scientists, and one of them, Isaac Spielrein, was a Soviet psychologist, a pioneer of work psychology. I think now we call this IO psychology. And she was always highly imaginative and very bright. However, her parents' marriage was turbulent, and she experienced physical violence from both of them and suffered from multiple somatic symptoms and obsessions. During her teens, she continued to be troubled emotionally and became infatuated first with her history teacher, then with a paternal uncle. But while at school, she resolved to go abroad to train as a physician, as a doctor. However, following the sudden death of her only sister, Amelia, from typhoid, Spielrein's mental health started to deteriorate, and at the age of 18, she suffered a breakdown with severe hysteria, including tics, grimaces, uncontrollable laughing and crying. And after an unsuccessful stay in a Swiss sanatorium, where she developed another infatuation with one of the doctors, she was admitted to the Bergholzli Mental Hospital near Zurich at age 19 in August 1904. At that time, the director was Eugene Bleuler, and one of his assistants was Carl Jung. Now, I mean, just from your knowledge of history of psychology and psychiatry, it was Kreplin who designated the idea of dementia praecox. It was Bleuler who came up with the terminology and the whole sort of thinking about schizophrenia, and the sort of dementia praecox sort of turning the corner and becoming something much more medically sophisticated. And Jung was there during that period of time. Now, I know that Dr. Kovler-Adler, I don't know, should I call you Susan? Mentioned the movie The Dangerous Method by David Cronenberg. Those of you who haven't seen it, I really suggest this. If you have any interest in Dr. Spielrein, You should give this a look. I was really, really surprised watching the movie. I've watched it about 4 times now. It actually, the hospital records, and this is another thing I think that you should have a look out for. This is a book called Sabina Spielrein, Forgotten Pioneer of Psychoanalysis. This is the 2nd edition, so it's very current. Within this book are all of her hospital records from the Berkholzli Clinic. Within this book are her diaries. Within this book are all of her correspondences between her and Carl Jung, and also several of her most important papers are in this book. I reviewed this book for the American Journal of Psychoanalysis back in September, and I expect that like one of these days, in one of their editions, my review will show up, because they've got a lot of people contributing. But I really recommend this as well. I recommended it in my review. I'm recommending it to you. But I was really surprised that the hospital records in this book, primarily written by Jung and director Eugene Bleuler, they verify a good deal of the historic veracity of David Cronenberg's 2011 film, A Dangerous Method, in which Sabina emerges as the true heroine and savant. This film surprisingly remained conscientiously aligned with the Berkholzli medical charting right from the opening scene, in which a 19-year-old Spielrein, sent by her family in Russia, is dragged from a horse-drawn carriage by 3 men. She's exhibiting violent symptoms consisting of hard-to-watch body contortions, twisting her arms together, yelling and screaming, while alternatively laughing and crying, displaying the classical evidences of hysteria known to 19th century medical writing and documented in her chart. In her initial encounters with Jung, she rocks back and forth. And by the way, this was all played by Keira Knightley, who I didn't really know who she was until she played Sabina. So anyway, apparently she really did a very good job. And so Sabina, like encountering Jung, was rocking back and forth and jutting her lower jaw grotesquely forward, touching herself in odd ways, stammers in a Russian accent. And though this might appear to be some Hollywood-esque effort to convey female madness, the original hospital records, as documented in this book, vindicate her unruliness and bizarre clinical presentation. We learn through the anamnesis, again through the clinical records, that she, the eldest of 5 children, was raised by extremely severe and punitive parents, often using corporal punishment and whipping as commonplace means of discipline. In one part of the clinical records, it recounts an incident which created a treatment decompensation, wherein she experienced the horrible night of sensing a cat or a person in her room, someone speaking in her ear, something moving on her back like a snail. It's noted that given what's been learned since 1905 in regards to a child's response to persistent and severe trauma, many of Sabina Spielrein's symptoms would be now considered expectable reactions to childhood traumatization. Further, were informed that following a 3-hour session with Jung, she confided that since 4 years old, she has experienced sexual arousal after a paternal beating, or even imagining the beating, or even hearing her brother being beaten, compelling her to habitually masturbate. She also confessed to Jung that at age 13 years old, her father forced her into a special room. She begged not to be spanked, but he subjected her to a beating under her skirt, made her kiss his hand, and a picture of her grandfather, and promised to be a good child. This revelation of abuse, humiliation, confused and admixed with sexuality was made possible by Jung's sessions of using the methods of Freud. But it also led to the good news, bad news of catharsis healing, and also the danger of such intimacy between a doctor and a patient. She actually, like I said, she was admitted in August 1904. And, you know, she had a pretty rapid recovery. And by October, she was ready for discharge. And she applied to medical school and started to assist Jung with word association tests in his laboratory. But during that period of time, she, quotes, fell in love with Jung. And so, by her own choice, she continued to reside at the Berkeley Hospital as a resident in the hospital from January. Now, remember, she was okay by October. She decided to remain there from January until June 1905, although she was no longer receiving treatment. She worked as an intern alongside other Russian students there, including Max Ettingon.
I think
Thank you. As well as expatriate psychiatrists who were studying with Bleuler, including Carl Abraham. Now, regarding this, what I said, having fallen in love with Jung, and of course she developed crushes on a few other people before that. Jung also was attracted to this patient. He described her as being oriental and voluptuous. After her hospital discharge, she continued her childhood ambition by studying medicine at the University of Zurich, but continued to be in outpatient treatment with Jung, engaging in a stormy love affair until 1909. Now, whether the scenes of sadomasochism depicted in the film, and that's where I'm not so sure that that ever happened. I don't know that anybody could prove that that happened. I mean, whether or to what extent the sexual relationship went is still not completely validated. But there is no doubt, as Joseph Heller's novel title proclaims. Joseph Heller, I think, who wrote Catch-22, he only wrote one other novel, and it was called Something Happened. I think it's appropriate to say something happened. Now, during that period of time, she did attend medical school at the University of Zurich from June 1905 to January 1911, excelling. she lived with a number of different apartments, mixing with a social circle that included mainly fellow Russian Jewish women medical students. And many of these, together with Spielrein, became fascinated with the emerging movement of psychoanalysis in Western Europe, and they studied with Bleuler and Jung. A number of them, like Spielrein, subsequently became psychiatrists, spent time with Freud in Vienna, and published in psychoanalytic journals. She wrote a dissertation that was supervised first by Bleuler and then by Jung. And then the title of the dissertation, this was in 1911 upon her graduation, was called Concerning the Psychological Content of a Case of Schizophrenia. And it was published in a German psychoanalytic journal, and Freud referenced it in the same volume in his postscript to the Schrager case. It was the first doctorate ever to appear in a psychoanalytic journal, and one of the first psychoanalytic case studies of schizophrenia. Her dissertation contributed greatly to the understanding of the language of people with schizophrenia. When I was attending the New School, I was also working in a psychiatric facility amongst a lot of schizophrenics, and I was very interested in psycholinguistics, language development, language, and so I spent 2 years writing a proposal on the language of schizophrenia. But I'm thinking, this person who I never knew, she wrote my dissertation. And if I knew she wrote it, I probably wouldn't have even bothered to propose it. Anyway, it was also the first dissertation written by a woman that was psychoanalytically oriented. She really was something. Now, she kept diaries, and these diaries were found hidden in a basement in Geneva in the mid-1970s. And, even her diaries, her writing is eloquent, but it's dense, it's hard. It's hard reading. This is not an easy read. And anything that she writes is not easy. Technical, full of literary allusions, as well as mythical allusions. No wonder the intellectual adhesion with Jung. The diaries of brilliant people who have kept them are beyond value. And in them, we see Sabina spelling out the outline of future contributions, mixed with her anger toward a lover who abandoned and disowned her to preserve his own repute, yet never named by name. But obviously, her doctor, lover, collaborator, Jung. This maneuver of anonymity, not naming, this has got a long legacy. In Ferenczi's clinical diary, written in 1932 but not published until 1995, he refers to his most important patient and co-analyst, Elizabeth Severn, as RN. And an equally critical patient and co-analyst, Clara Thompson, as DM. However, I'm not going to discuss this because the next presenter is going to speak about this at length, but I just wanted to mention it. This was commonplace. The discovery of her diaries and also her correspondences with Jung is sort of a little bit startling to me. I studied Jung at the New School. It was a requirement. There's not a lot of graduate schools in the United States that require you to go through your comprehensives and know Jung. I can't think of that many places. The New School required it. But, it was really hard for me to imagine the serious, scholarly, Protestant Jung writing love letters to his paramour like a love-struck schoolboy. Within these letters to her, we have Jung apologizing, praising, attempting to arrange meetings at various European venues, but we also gain access to the attempt to transform the affair into something more collegial. Also describing the collective unconscious, describing meetings with Freud and other analytic luminaries. Within the letters, it becomes self-evident Jung's unawareness of transference, and even more so, the phenomena of his own erotic countertransference, which sadly but predictably results in an acting out and then an abysmal breaking off relations with his former patient, leaving her betrayed, abandoned, and dismissed, as is illuminated in her diary entries. As an aside, these pioneers knew not what they were tampering with. A dangerous method. Such that Jung turned out to be not capable of monogamy and repetitively got involved with Jewish patients such as Tony Wolff. Unknowing of his own darkness, never having been analyzed, he was capable of being self-serving, insensitive, and cruel, particularly in defense of his cover-up and break with Sabina, in fear of his career, reputation, and marriage. Sabina had this fantasy that they were going to have a child together, and that the child was going to be called Siegfried. This is, I don't think I have enough time to get into the myth. Yeah, right. But maybe during the discussion portion, those of you not familiar, if you ask me about why Siegfried, I'll tell you about it, but I don't think it's worth getting into now. And during the ensuing months, Jung wrote to Freud about this relationship, at first accusing Spielrein of having tried unsuccessfully to seduce him, and then admitting that he had become romantically involved with her. Well, at the same time, Spielrein also wrote to Freud, making it clear that for a few months their relationship had been in some fashion physical. It had involved what Spielrein referred to as poetry. She's, if you really want to read her, in her own words, she's challenging. Is worth it, but it's challenging. Well, as might be expected, so both of them were seeking Freud's help. And and this erotic transference and this relationship, whatever it turned out to be, because I don't think anybody has got a handle on this, but like, it peaked between 1908 and 1911. And 1911, like I said, is the year, you know, that she wrote she wrote my doctoral dissertation. And then, you know, things sort of started to chill. But both were seeking Freud's help. Jung was afraid of ruining his career and his marriage. So he actually broke relations with her in March 1909. And he wrote to Freud of the, quotes, scandal being spread about him by a female student. Well, Spielrein also contacted Freud, seeking consultation. Freud declined. Yet he wrote to Jung in June 1909, claiming, quotes, I wrote Fräulein Spielrein a letter affecting ignorance, pretending to think that her suggestion was that of an overzealous enthusiast. Such experiences, though painful, are hard to avoid. I've come close to it a number of times and had narrow escapes. But it helps us to develop the thick skin that we need to dominate, quotes, countertransference, a permanent problem for us. Jung and Spielrein did renew contact a year later. And only this time, he had comments on her dissertation, they met, they wrote. This was sublimated erotic desire for each other in favor of an intellectual union. The theme of sacrifice became central in her subsequent writing. In December 1910, on the eve of completing her medical training and leaving for Vienna, she wrote this, quotes, how remarkable is the difference in the way that he, the man, and I, the woman, contemplated the tasks ahead of us. Within him, the sacredness of his profession occupied the foreground. Within me, the sacredness of love. In October 1911, Spielrein first met Freud in Vienna. And in the following month, she read her first and really iconic paper entitled Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being at one of Freud's inner circle meetings, in the presence of Freud, Faydern, Rank, Sachs, Steckel, Tosk, and many other of the inner circle. She introduced the concept of the death instinct, later co-opted by Freud in his Beyond the Pleasure principle in 1920. This is a paper that she published in 1912, and in which, in 1920, he credited Sabina with a footnote. To this day, and it might be that, many of her work still is not translated into English. I mean, she wrote in German and French. Again, within this book, there's at least, there is this seminal paper, and maybe 3 or 4 others, and that's why I'm recommending the book. But there's a lot of stuff that, like, I didn't have access to. There's a lot of stuff that you guys probably don't have, unless, like, you're conversant in French and German. I'm not. I speak first-grade French. That's it. And I speak dreams. Those are my 2 languages. But, you know, like, her idea of the destructive drive turned out to be somehow the most influential of her ideas in terms of importance in psychoanalysis. And later, her concept of destructive drive was taken by Freud as the death instinct. And her erotic transference to Jung and vice versa led her to realize a destructive aspect in the drive to love. Now, I want to go directly to this paper and sort of excerpt the paper or just give you a little idea of, like, what this paper is all about. And I'll try to, like, sort of intersperse it with some things, you know, that, like, she got from Jung, and some things that have to do with Freud. But anyway, she begins this paper with the idea that, like, she wants to investigate, like, this one question about sexuality. Why does this powerful reproductive instinct harbor negative feelings in addition to inherent positive feelings? For, like, the negative being anxiety and disgust must be overcome to use the drive appropriately. Well, she comes up with a few possibilities that were, you know, going around at the time. The first possibility she comes up with is that some see it as a result of child rearing. To keep the drive within its bounds by teaching each child to consider the fulfillment of sexual wishes as dirty and forbidden. Okay. Secondly, she cites Otto Gross, and he relates the feeling of disgust in the presence of sexual products to their anatomical proximity to lifeless excreta, which he equates with death. Now, what is he talking about? What he's talking about is that genitalia are in close proximity to the rectum and to the ureter, which produce lifeless, dead matter. And so that this anatomical proximity may be what accounts for the negative in sexuality. Freud traces opposition back to anxiety and repression of initial positive sexual wishes. Bleuler considers the negativity to be a defense. Yet, Sabina, like, she made a link with the sexual instinct by locating the destructive drive as a component within the reproductive drive. And, I mean, her means of getting there is to cite, you know, her colleague, I don't know what to refer to him as, Jung. In Jung's Symbols of Transformation, he says, quotes, passionate longing, the libido, consists of 2 aspects. It's power that beautifies everything and, in certain cases, destroys everything. To be fruitful provokes one's downfall. At the rise of the next generation, the previous one has exceeded its peak. Our descendants become our most dangerous enemies, for whom we are unprepared. They will survive and take power from our enfeebled hands. Thus Jung describes the inexorable interweaving of love and death. And thus, with the idea of sacrifice, in the sense that nothing new can come into being without the destruction of the older order. Spielrein's contribution was to take this idea of Jung's one step further and to demonstrate that the destructive drive derived from the libido was an integral element in the development of sexuality. And now I'm going to just return back to her paper. So she starts citing certain biological facts. She'll say, reproduction amounts to a union of female and male cells. The unity of the individual cells is destroyed. And from the product of this destruction, new life originates. Following the production of the new generation, many lower creatures, such as the mayfly, forfeit their lives. Creation is thus both survival and simultaneously destruction, the dying off of the adult. Now, I don't know how many of you, either through reading or personal experience, have come across this pitiful situation of mayfly. But after I graduated from Michigan State, I worked in Detroit for a year. And I had a friend who lived in the suburb of Detroit near Lake St. Clair. And one day in May, and it was only one day, the atmosphere was full of adult mayflies mating. I mean, you really literally couldn't see in front of you. The air was full of this. People would stay indoors on that day. And they had been larvae in the lake bed, were born for 24 hours, reproduced larvae, which would then sink down to the bottom of Lake St. Clair and sit in the lake bed until next May, when the one-day process would be repeated. The next day, I can remember that the Department of Sanitation would brush and plow roadways strewn with hardened insect carcasses. I never saw anything like this in my life.
Sex and death.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a very radical example of the point that Sabina is trying to make. The individual must strongly hunger for this new creation in order to place its own destruction in creation's service. Again from her paper. Along with the joyful feeling of coming into being is also feelings of resistance, anxiety, disgust, not from proximity to excreta, nor from the renunciation of sexual activity, but directly corresponding to the destructive components of the sexual instinct. Freud traces our subsequent direct or sublimated impulses for love back to the infantile period, when we felt our initial pleasurable sensations through our caretakers. We always seek to re-experience these pleasurable sensations. Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, found Sabina's description of the sadistic components of the sexual instinct as, quotes, destructive, he found this to be unclear. And he wrote to Jung, quotes, "It troubles me that she wants to subordinate the psychological material to biological matters. This dependency is unacceptable as dependency on philosophy, physiology, or brain anatomy." I'm going to show you just in a moment how he did the exact same thing in his essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He did the exact same thing that he was criticizing her for. Anyway, even though this essay on destruction as a cause of coming into being is at times difficult to decipher, but her conclusion is clear. I quote her, "My examples sufficiently show that corresponding to the biological facts, the reproductive drive also consists psychologically of two antagonistic components, a destructive drive as well as a drive for coming into being." She was not, like Freud, arguing that the destructive drive was a separate and opposing force to the life instinct or libido. So, I mean, just to put it in its simplest terms, she doesn't see the dichotomy as being between eros and thanatos, you know, the life instinct and the death instinct, but sees both as being part of the reproductive instinct. She took Freud's idea that, quotes, "the germ of sexual pleasure in the adult resides in the infantile sources of pleasure." She explains, "We could just as readily derive everything from the nurturing instinct as from sexuality. For example, the mother loves the child because sucking relieves the mammary gland. One loves a man or woman because coitus releases the organism's bothersome excretions. Pleasurable sensation is thus transformed to the object bringing relief." She is here foreshadowing something like an object relations approach to instinct, in that, quotes, "the nurturing instinct is reliant on the mother-infant primary relationship." So the destructive drive is not simply within the reproductive drive, but more basically within the nurturing instinct as the first instance of pleasure, thus tracing it to its pre-edible roots. The regressive pull toward loss of self within the other, as can be experienced in the sexual act, is present in its precursor, an image of the suckling infant at the breast. For example, the experience of being at one with the world, this oceanic feeling. I mean, if you look at an infant sucking at the breast, and the infant's eyes roll back into his or her head, this infant is on another planet, a planet of oceanic feeling, like there's loss of self and all there is pleasure. Okay. Freud has not, again, I'm back to her paper. Freud has not investigated what pleasurable feeling is and how it originates. He begins at a stage where pleasure is already established. That infantile pleasurable sensations are precursors of later pleasurable sexual sensations. Freud is correct, accepting that the striving for pleasure and suppression of displeasure as bases of all psychic productions. But I defend the viewpoint that the personal psyche, governed by unconscious impulses that lie deeper and in their demands, are unconcerned with our feeling reactions. Pleasure is merely the affirmative reaction of the ego to those deeper demands. The destructive component within the reproductive drive can manifest in benign or malignant form. The instinct for preservation of the species, a reproductive drive, expresses psychologically in the tendency to dissolve and assimilate the transformation of the I to the we, creating a new form of the primal substance. Where love reigns, the ego, the ominous despot, dies. Love as a merging or loss of ego. But contrast this with the expression of the destructive drive with what happens if love fails and gives rise to images of death. The regressive pull to be merged with the other as at the expense of the ego in an effort to find nurturing satisfactions lacking in infancy. And much of this theorizing is coming from her own experience of failed love, an attempt to lose her ego within an idealized love. A case in point being Jung. In locating the destructive drive within the reproductive drive, she makes a further distinction between self-preservation and preservation of the species. Self-preservation is simple, while preservation of the species, which must dissolve the old and create the new, has positive and negative. It's ambivalent. Thus, the impulse of positive summons the impulse of negative and opposes it. If we're talking about self-preservation, it's static. It's simply to protect from foreign influences. But if we're talking about preservation of the species, it's dynamic. It involves change, resurrection of the individual in a new form. There can be no change without destruction of the former condition. Both Jung and Freud closed their eyes to the causes of her self-destructiveness and masochism. Their failure to understand her reenactment and her past within the analytic relationship with Jung influenced how she conceptualized the idea of the death instinct. For Freud, the death instinct was an innate force opposing the life instinct, regressively reducing excitations of the life instinct. For Jung, death instinct is a regressive pull in which the ego dissolved for the purpose of renewal. Not opposing the life instinct, but serving it. But both Freud and Jung missed acknowledging the role of the individual's history and the impact on psychological development and strength of the repetition compulsion. Now, I know throughout my talk, I've referred to Freud's essay, 1920 essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So just humor me and let me just cite a few things from his essay. I'll be quick. And, you know, it's a little bit, tell me when I have 5. I don't mean to lecture this audience, all of whom I'm sure knows beyond the pleasure principle, and like I don't want to, you know, tell you something that you already know, but in light of what I've been discussing, I think there's a few points I just want to make. Now, I mean, Freud's point was like, you know, that there's two opposing drives. There's eros, the libido, which is creativity, harmony, sexual union, reproduction, self-preservation, and thanatos, destruction, repetition, aggression, compulsion, self-destruction. And, you know, when he starts talking about this, he actually got critiqued. Ernest Jones said, you know, the train of thought in this work is by no means easy to follow. That's a softball. Ernest Jones. Yeah. Freud himself said, you know, the second section of this work is often far-fetched speculation. Now, like, he was trying to explain the inevitable presence of unpleasant experiences in the life of the mind, but he doesn't contradict the dominance of the pleasure principle. So look for unexpected forces, quotes, beyond the pleasure principle. And he names 4 things. I'm not going to get into this, I'm just going to name them. He talks about childhood games. He talks about the recurrent dreams of war neurotics. He talks about the pattern of self-injury of some patients. And he talks about the tendency of many patients in psychoanalysis to act out over and over again unpleasant experiences. Now, this has got to be explained. He winds up saying that the repetition compulsion lies in the essentially conservative feature of instinctual life. Thus, repetition compulsion is on equal footing with, quotes, an urge to restore an earlier state of things, ultimately that of the original inorganic condition. Thus, the aim of life is death, since inanimate things existed before living ones. This is the concept of the death instinct. Freud plunged into every field of knowledge, including philosophy, biology, mythology, in search of corroborative evidence. The very same criticisms he made of Sabina's destruction paper 8 years earlier. He's doing the exact same thing. Right? You're right. Eventually, he decided he could find clinical, not speculation, of manifestation of death instinct in masochism. Not secondary sadism, but a primary masochism. And here's where he cites in a footnote Sabina's 1912 paper. I'm going to conclude, so that Ina doesn't have to come up here and give me the hook. I have a very brief conclusion. Thanks for bearing with me, by the way. Okay. Dr. Spielrein published at least 30 psychoanalytic papers in French and German, mostly not yet translated into English. The 2 most influential being the 2 I mentioned, the doctoral dissertation 1911 and her master work, The Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being, which was 1912. And, you know, regarding her affair with Jung, this was mostly a malignant regression. It yielded brilliance about transference, countertransference. It helped Jung with his concept of the anima. And also showed that as analysts, our emotions and human frailties cannot be kept out of the analytic relationship, disappointing Freud's hope that as scientists, all analysts could work, Freud's hope that as scientists, all analysts could work with patients from an objective and neutral stance, like surgeons. Patients, quotes, fall in love with their analysts, and vice versa. But lest one need proof of the precarious danger of acting out one's erotic transference, again within this book and within Sabina's diary, she exposes Jung's attempt to intellectualize their sexual affair and Spielrein's refusal to let him get away with it. I want to quote this to you. Quotes, "And this is supposed to be proof of the refinement of your unconscious? You might make others believe that, exclamation point. Not me, who thinks otherwise." Besides contributing to the comprehension of schizophrenia and the dialectic of sexuality and destructiveness, she also developed theory regarding developmental psychology, including children's speech. She wrote a paper on the origins of the word mama and papa. She wrote a paper on suckling at the breast and the object relations aspects of personality. She influenced the thinking of Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, and Jean Piaget, who she analyzed for 8 months in 1921. As a postscript, it should be noted that her 3 brothers were all academics, were arrested under Stalin's terror campaign and killed in a gulag. And that on August 11th, 1942, Dr. Spielrein and her 2 daughters, Eva and Renata, were herded, along with many thousands of others, to the Zemievskoy beam, which was a ravine just outside of her hometown, Rostov. And the 3 of them, she and her 2 daughters, and all the thousands of others, were shot as Jews by the Nazi death squads. I hope I've given you some inkling into someone who's become my hero.